My name is Ray Don Bobo, and I live in a clean, well-situated mobile home just outside Smackover, a place whose name has provided more amusement to outsiders than it ever has to its residents. I am not a man given to flights of fancy or public spectacle. I pay my taxes, I keep a tidy patch of zoysia grass, and I believe that a man's affairs should be handled with a minimum of fuss and a maximum of directness, which is why on the third Tuesday of May, I found myself in the polished corridors of the Ouachita County Courthouse, seeking redress for a grievance of a delicate and personal nature. The source of my trouble was a man named Earl T. Shedler, and the Ag Cat biplane he flew with what I considered to be a reckless disregard for the peace of the citizenry. Specifically, the peace of my champion Old English Bantam rooster, General Beauregard. General Beauregard is not some common barnyard fowl. He is a creature of refined sensibilities and impeccable lineage, a two-time winner of the most stately plumage ribbon at the South Arkansas Poultry Congress. His crow is not a ragged shriek, but a crisp, three-note declaration of territorial integrity. Or it was, until Earl T. Shedler decided to use my property as a rehearsal stage for his annual war against the mosquito. He had come in low from the east, a yellow beast trailing a ghost of mist, no more than 50 feet off my longleaf pines. The sound was a biblical rent in the fabric of the morning. I saw General Beauregard, who had been presiding over his morning constitutional, levitate a full 2 feet in the air. He landed in a heap of ruffled dignity, his comb gone pale. Since that moment, his crow had been reduced to a hesitant, questioning squawk, a sound more suited to a Cornish hen with a head cold. The insult was profound. A man's rooster is an extension of his own sovereignty. My first course of action was direct. I drove my Ford Ranger to the airstrip outside Camden, where Earl T. Shedler was said to base his operations. I found him reeking of insecticide and self-satisfaction, a man whose face bore the topographical record of a life lived in squinting defiance of the sun. "Mr. Shedler," I began, my hat in my hands as a sign of initial goodwill, "I am Ray Don Bobo. Your aerial maneuvers yesterday have had a deleterious effect on my rooster's psychological equilibrium." He wiped his hands on an oily rag and looked at me as if I were a complex mathematical problem he had no intention of solving. "You say my plane spooked your chicken?" "He is not a chicken," I clarified. "He is a bantam rooster of some distinction, and he was not merely spooked. His spirit has been dampened. His confidence is shot. I am here to request a formal, written apology." Earl T. Shedler let out a short, percussive laugh that seemed to startle the sparrows nesting in the hangar rafters. "An apology to a chicken?" "To me," I said, my voice level. "The rooster is the aggrieved party, but he cannot read. The apology is a matter of restoring the proper order of things. It is a point of personal privilege." He shook his head, the laugh turning into a smirk that I found structurally unsound. "Tell you what, pal, you get that chicken a tiny pair of earmuffs, and I'll see about maybe not flying so low. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got to go make the world safe from West Nile virus." This was, of course, an unacceptable outcome. The issue was not noise abatement, it was a matter of honor. A man who will not apologize for rattling a rooster's soul is a man with a fundamental misunderstanding of the social contract. Which brought me to the courthouse. I had put on my good boots and a starched shirt. I sought out the office of the County Justice of Peace, a man named Buddy R. Lonsdale, whose campaign signs had promised common sense for the common man. I explained the situation to a woman behind a plexiglass window whose expression suggested she had heard every possible permutation of human folly and was still unimpressed. She directed me to a bench. After a wait of some 45 minutes, during which I had ample time to contemplate the slow, inexorable decay of the ceiling tiles, I was shown in to Buddy R. Lonsdale's office. He was a large man, packed into his chair like a sausage into its casing. On his wall was a framed poster of a bald eagle next to a Bible verse and a calendar from a company that sold industrial-grade culverts. "Now then, Mr. Bobo," he said, steepling his fingers, "let's hear it. Donna says it's about a rooster." I laid out the facts of the case with the dispassionate clarity of a legal scholar. I detailed the general's distinguished record, the nature of Earl T. Shedler's aerial trespass, the subsequent emotional trauma, and the pilot's flagrant refusal to make amends. I concluded by reiterating that I was not seeking monetary damages. "I am a firm believer in states' rights, Mr. Bobo," he said, as if this was a direct and logical response to my complaint. "We here in Ouachita County believe in handling our own affairs, but an apology, that's a matter for a man's own conscience. The government can't compel contrition. That's a violation of, well, it's a violation of something, I'm sure of it. I'm not asking for compelled contrition. I'm asking for a ruling that an offense has occurred, a public acknowledgement. The apology is merely the standard remedy for such a breach of decency." He leaned back, his chair groaning in protest. "Son, you're talking about bird law, and that's a tricky thing. This is a right to farm state, and a right to fly state, I reckon. Earl's spraying for the public good. You can't impede progress just because your fowl has a case of the vapors." It was then I realized I was not in a temple of justice. I was in a place where common sense had been compacted into a dense, useless lump. My grievance was not with the state, or the farm, or the march of progress. It was with a single man, and the apparatus of society was aligning itself to protect his right to be discourteous. "Thank you for your time, Judge," I said, rising. I placed my hat back on my head. "You're a good man for coming in, Ray Don," he said, a note of finality in his voice. "You tell General Beauregard, is it? You tell him to hang in there." I walked out into the thick, soupy air of a South Arkansas afternoon. The system had failed me. The social contract was null and void. But my resolve had not weakened. It had clarified. If a man could find no justice in the halls of government, he was left with no choice but to pursue his own remedies. Earl T. Shedler had refused to restore order. Therefore, I would have to introduce a new element of chaos into his world. It was a point of personal privilege. A man who has exhausted the remedies of civilization is not an outlaw. He is simply a man who has been returned to a state of nature. The Ouachita County Courthouse, with its peel and paint and indifferent bureaucracy, had proven to be a dead end. My grievance was now a private matter between myself, Earl T. Shedler, and the silent judging eyes of the Lord.
And since the Lord had not seen fit to strike Earl's ag cat from the sky, I concluded that he was taking a position of benevolent neutrality, leaving the next move to me. My objective was not vengeance. Vengeance is a messy, emotional affair. My goal was correction. I needed to introduce a significant but non-destructive impediment to Earl T. Shedler's professional activities, a clear and unmistakable signal that his actions had consequences. I needed to inconvenience him into a state of contemplation. After considering and rejecting several options for their lack of elegance, including a series of carefully placed roofing nails and a formal complaint to the Federal Aviation Administration, which I felt would involve an excess of paperwork, I settled on a plan of what I termed aerial denial. For 3 consecutive mornings, I commenced surveillance from the cab of my Ranger, parked a discreet quarter-mile from the airstrip on an old logging road. I employed a pair of Bushnell 10x42 binoculars and a spiral-bound notebook to log his movements. A pattern quickly emerged. Earl T. Shedler was a man of habit. He arrived at 6:15 a.m., spent 45 minutes on pre-flight shakes and what appeared to be a breakfast of coffee and a Hostess snowball, and was airborne by 7:05 a.m. His first pass over the mosquito-plagued swamplands bordering my property occurred with remarkable consistency at 7:17 a.m. This was my window. The next phase required the procurement of materials. I drove to El Dorado, to a large, offensively cheerful establishment called Party Time USA. A young woman with a name tag that read Brianna and a stud in her nose that I found distracting asked if she could help me. I require helium, I stated, a significant quantity, and balloons, 200 of them. Brianna's professionally cheerful expression faltered. Wow, that's a big party. Is it for like a gender reveal? It is not, I said. It is a matter of personal privilege. I would prefer the balloons be a dignified, uniform color. Do you have silver? An hour later, I was driving back to Smackover with a large, leased tank of compressed helium secured in the bed of my Ranger and 4 bags of 50 silver latex balloons on the passenger seat. The total cost was $112.48, an expense I considered a necessary investment in the restoration of social order. That evening, in the quiet solitude of my workshop, I prepared my instruments of correction. On 200 small squares of cardstock, I neatly printed the same message: a formal, written apology to Ray-Ban Bobo for the psychological distress inflicted upon his rooster, General Beauregard, is still expected. Your failure to comply has necessitated this action. I punched a small hole in each corner of the cards and tied them to kite string to the 200 uninflated silver balloons. The following morning, I was in position by 6:45 a.m. I had driven my Ranger to a clearing in the pines that sat directly under Earl T. Shedler's established flight path. The helium tank hissed softly as I inflated the first balloon, then the next, and then the next. Soon the interior of my truck cab was a shimmering, bobbing mass of silver orbs, each bearing its small declarative payload. It was a strangely festive scene for such a serious undertaking. At 7:15 a.m., I heard it, the faint, familiar drone of the ag cat approaching from the east. General Beauregard, safely cloistered in his coop, let out a nervous cluck. I took a deep breath. Timing was critical. Too early, and the balloons would drift out of position. Too late, and they would be a mere spectacle, not an impediment. The drone grew louder. I could see the yellow wings against the pale blue of the morning sky. At what I judged to be a distance of half a mile, I opened both doors of my truck. The effect was immediate and, I must admit, quite beautiful. 200 silver spheres ascended as one, a silent, glittering column rising into the path of the oncoming airplane. They were not a weapon, but a question mark, a sudden and undeniable fact that Earl T. Shedler would have to address. From my vantage point, I saw the ag cat's nose dip and then bank sharply to the left. The engine noise changed pitch as Earl aborted his spraying run, circling wide around the shimmering cloud of my protest. He did not attempt a second pass. He simply turned his aircraft around and flew back in the direction of the airstrip, his mission of mosquito eradication incomplete. I watched until his plane was a yellow speck. I had not damaged his property. I had not endangered his person. I had simply and effectively told him that this particular patch of sky was for the moment contested airspace. I gathered my equipment and drove home, a profound sense of satisfaction settling over me. I had made my point. The next move was his. I did not have to wait long. At a little past 8 o'clock, a cloud of dust announced the arrival of a mud-spottered Chevrolet Silverado that skidded to a halt in my driveway. Earl T. Shedler got out, his face the color of a ripe plum. He was holding one of my silver balloons, its attached card fluttering in the breeze. He marched up to my porch, where I was enjoying a cup of coffee. "Bobo!" he shouted, a full 10 yards from my front steps. "What in the Sam Hill do you think you're doing? You could have brought my plane down." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Good morning, Mr. Shedler," I said calmly. "My calculations indicated that a standard latex balloon filled with helium poses no significant structural threat to a 1978 Grumman ag cat, but they do represent a considerable distraction to the pilot. That was the intent." He stumped up onto the porch, waving the balloon in my face. "Are you crazy? I've got a contract with the county. You have declared war on mosquito control." "No, Mr. Shedler," I said, setting my cup down and rising to my feet. "You have declared war on common courtesy. I am merely the resistance. Now, about that apology."
Confrontation on a man's own porch is a delicate social ballet. My porch is a sanctuary of quiet contemplation, not a stage for heated debate. Yet there stood Earl T. Shedler, his face a thundercloud, brandishing a deflating silver balloon as if it were a writ of indictment. "An apology," he sputtered, his voice cracking with indignation. "I ought to be calling the sheriff. You interfered with a licensed aerial applicator in the performance of his duties. That's a federal offense, you lunatic." I regarded him with the calm patience of a man who has already gamed out every possible scenario. "First," I began, holding up a single finger, "I am not a lunatic. My actions were the result of a deliberate and reasoned thought process. Second, I would welcome the involvement of law enforcement. A third-party mediator may be precisely what this situation requires. And third, you are standing on my zoysia grass. I would appreciate it if you would return to the gravel of the driveway." He glanced down at his boots, which were indeed leaving indentations in my immaculate lawn, and took a grudging step back. The retreat seemed to drain some of the fire from him, replacing it with a simmering resentment. He pulled out a cellular telephone. "That's it, Bobo. You've crossed a line." He stabbed at the screen with a thick finger. "I'm calling Bulldog Drummond." Sheriff Dwayne Bulldog Drummond was a man whose reputation preceded him. He had earned his nickname not for his tenacity in fighting crime, but for a facial structure that bore an uncanny resemblance to the mascot of the local high school.
He was said to be a man who valued civic order and quiet afternoons above all else, and who viewed any disruption to that peace with the weary resignation of a Sisyphus who'd just been handed another boulder. While Earl T. Shedler provided the dispatcher with an animated and, I suspect, highly embellished account of my balloon barrage, I went inside and poured a glass of sweet tea. When I returned, I offered it to him. Hydration is important in moments of high stress. He glared at me and turned his back. 20 minutes later, the crunch of tires announced the sheriff's arrival. His patrol car, a Ford Crown Victoria of advanced years, came to a stop behind Earl's Silverado. Sheriff Drummond emerged slowly, a large man moving with the deliberate economy of someone who is paid by the hour. He adjusted his gun belt, settled his hat, and surveyed the scene. 2 middle-aged men, 1 deflated balloon, and a palpable aura of intractable stubbornness. "Morning, Earl. Radon? Got a call about some aeronautical tomfoolery?" Earl launched into his narrative immediately, gesticulating wildly, using the balloon to demonstrate the alleged near miss. He painted a picture of a deranged saboteur attempting to swat his plane from the sky for reasons of pure malice. When he had finished, breathless and flushed, Sheriff Drummond turned his gaze to me. "Radon, you want to tell me why you were launching a birthday party into an FAA-recognized flight path?" I calmly recounted the entire saga, beginning with General Beauregard's initial trauma, my polite request for an apology, my appeal to the justice of peace, and culminating in my carefully calibrated act of non-violent protest. I then presented the sheriff with one of the spare cards from my workshop. He held the small square of cardstock in his large hands and read it, his lips moving slightly. He read it again. A long silence descended, broken only by the chirping of a distant blue jay. He looked from the card to me, then to Earl, then back to the card. Finally, he took off his hat and wiped his brow with the back of his forearm. He said, "Let me get this straight. This is about a chicken." "He is a bantam rooster of distinguished lineage," I corrected gently. "And you, Earl, flew low enough to ruffle his lineage." "I was spraying for mosquitoes, Bulldog. It's my job." "And you, Radon," his eyes locked onto mine, decided the appropriate response was 200 Mylar emissaries of your discontent. Son, do you have any idea the kind of federal paperwork you could have generated if one of these things had gotten sucked into his intake?" My research indicated the risk was negligible. It was a communicative, not a destructive act. Sheriff Drummond sighed, a sound of deep, existential fatigue. He put his hat back on. "All right, here's what's gonna happen. Radon, your career in atmospheric messaging is over. There will be no more balloons, no kites, no bottle rockets, no flock of trained pigeons carrying angry notes. You are grounded. Are we clear?" I nodded. "Understood." "Earl," he said, turning, "the man has a point. Maybe not a 200 balloons point, but a point. You're spraying the swamp, not his front porch. Gain a little altitude when you pass over his property. Give the rooster some breathing room." "Now hold on," he started. "That's not a request," he said, his voice dropping a half octave. "That's me, the duly elected sheriff of Ouachita County, preventing a future breach of the peace. You will fly higher. Are we clear?" Earl T. Shedler clamped his jaw shut, his neck muscles bulging. He gave a short jerk nod. "Good," Sheriff Drummond said. He looked back and forth between us. "This is over. I don't want to hear another word about this rooster from either of you. I've got actual problems to deal with. Go on home, Earl." Earl threw the limp balloon to the ground, shot me a look of pure poison, and stomped back to his truck. He spun his tires in my gravel as he left, a final petty act of defiance. The sheriff watched him go before turning back to me. "You're a piece of work, Ray Don. You know that." "I believe in due process," I replied. He just shook his head and walked back to his car. I was left alone on my porch in the sudden quiet. A truce had been declared, but a truce is not justice. The sheriff addressed the symptoms, the low flying, the balloon barrage, but not the underlying disease, the grievous insult to a man's honor and the unquieted spirit of his rooster. The apology was still outstanding. The war was not over. It had just gone cold.
The truce imposed by Sheriff Drummond was, in practice, a ceasefire of convenience. Earl T. Shedler now flew over my property at an altitude I deemed respectful, his yellow ag cat a distant, less offensive buzz in the morning sky. General Beauregard, in turn, had begun the slow, arduous process of reclaiming his vocal authority. His crow, while still tentative, was starting to regain its former baritone confidence. By the letter of the sheriff's decree, the conflict was resolved, but the spirit of the law, and more importantly the spirit of my rooster, remained unappeased. An apology was still owed. The debt of honor was still on the ledger. A direct assault was no longer an option. I had been legally disarmed of my balloons. This new phase of the conflict, therefore, required a pivot from the tactical to the strategic. My target could no longer be Earl T. Shedler's airplane, but his enterprise. I would not attack the man, but the very concept of his work. My new theater of operations would be the hearts and minds of the citizens of Ouachita County. I called it Operation Public Dissuasion. My first step was to establish a credible, if entirely fictional, front. At the public library in Camden, I spent an afternoon designing a simple, authoritative letterhead on a public computer. At the top, in a bold Times New Roman font, it read, "The Ouachita County Citizens Committee for Ecological Sanity." Beneath it was a motto I had composed myself: "Common sense solutions for uncommon problems." The address was a post office box I had rented for the occasion. The centerpiece of my campaign was a single-page informational flyer, which I composed with the meticulous care of a scholar. It was designed not to alarm, but to gently instill a profound and unsettling doubt. It read, "Concerned about mosquitoes? You should be. But is aerial spraying the answer?" The Ouachita County Citizens Committee for Ecological Sanity has compiled troubling preliminary data regarding the long-term behavioral effects of repeated chemical spraying on our local mosquito population, which is Culex pipiens. While the short-term effects of aerial spraying are known, a temporary reduction in mosquito numbers, our research points to a potential unintended consequence: post-traumatic swarm fortification. Evidence suggests that the survivors of these chemical assaults are not merely the lucky few. They are, in fact, a more robust, more cunning, and more aggressive breed of mosquito. These hypervectors have been observed exhibiting chemical apathy, a developing immunity to common commercial insecticides, targeted aggression, a disturbing preference for warm-blooded creatures of routine, including domestic pets, livestock, and prize-winning poultry, advanced evasive maneuvering, an uncanny ability to anticipate and avoid the common hand slap. Are we creating a super mosquito?
The committee advocates for a return to traditional, time-tested methods of pest control that work in harmony with nature, not against it. We urge all citizens to consider planting citronella, marigolds, and lavender. The installation of bat houses has also shown remarkable efficacy. Protect your family, protect your property, protect your peace of mind. Tell the Ouachita County Mosquito Abatement Board that you demand a smarter, safer, and more sane approach. I printed 250 copies at a self-service copy shop in Fort Ice, paying in cash to avoid a paper trail. The next 2 nights, under the cloak of a waning moon, I undertook the quiet work of dissemination. I placed flyers on the windshields of trucks in the parking lot of the Piggly Wiggly. I slipped them into the newspaper boxes at the end of long rural driveways. I tacked one to the cork board at the feed and seed store, right next to a notice for a lost blue tick hound. The effect was not immediate, but it was palpable. A week later, while purchasing a bag of high-protein layer feed, I overheard 2 men in overalls discussing the matter. "You see that thing about the smart skeeters?" one asked, scratching his chin. "My wife's all worked up about it, wants me to build a bat house." "I'm telling you, Arlene," the other said to the woman at the checkout counter, "my little poodle Princess got eat up last night, worse than ever. They went right for her, just like that paper said." Arlene nodded grimly. "They're organized is what they are. I saw a swarm of them by my bird bath, and it looked like they were having a meeting." The whispers were working. I had injected a single, potent drop of doubt into the public consciousness, and it was spreading. My war was no longer being fought in the sky, but in the checkout lines and front porches of the county. The proof of my success came the following Tuesday. I was driving past the airstrip and saw Earl T. Shedler standing by his hangar, his hands on his hips, arguing with a man in a county maintenance truck. I couldn't hear the words, but Earl's body language spoke volumes. His shoulders were slumped. His face was a mask of frustrated disbelief. He looked like a man trying to explain that the sky was blue to a committee that had just been convinced it was plaid. He was no longer a confident lord of the air. He was a public servant besieged by the very public he was trying to serve. The pressure was building. An apology, I felt, was now not just a matter of honor, but a matter of sound business practice.
A successful whisper campaign does not announce itself with a trumpet blast. It grows in the quiet corners of a community, a creeping vine of supposition and doubt. My flyers had done their work. The concept of the hypervector mosquito had taken root in the fertile soil of Ouachita County's collective anxiety. I saw the evidence on my weekly trips into town. A man at the hardware store was purchasing lumber for what he loudly declared to be a deluxe bat condominium. 2 women in the produce aisle at Piggly Wiggly were earnestly debating the merits of lavender oil versus a screened-in porch. The war was being won without a single shot fired. My post office box in Camden had, until this point, been a simple strategic asset. I checked it once a week, expecting nothing more than the sweet satisfaction of an empty container. On this particular Tuesday, however, it contained a single, crisply folded letter. The envelope was addressed to the committee. I opened it with the cautious curiosity of a bomb disposal expert. The letter was written in a neat, lupin cursive on floral stationery. It was from a Mrs. Mildred P. Fincher of East Camden. Mrs. Fincher expressed her profound gratitude for the committee's courageous and timely work in exposing the super mosquito threat. She went on to detail her own observations, which included a swarm of mosquitoes that seemed to be communicating via a series of coordinated, high-pitched whines.
and a personal theory that they were targeting her prize-winning azaleas out of pure spite. The letter concluded with a request to formally join the committee, stating that she had some experience in organizing and was ready to serve. This was an unforeseen complication. The Ouachita County Citizens Committee for Ecological Sanity had a membership of 1, and its chairman had no desire to expand the roster. A committee of 1 is a model of efficiency. A committee of 2 is a hotbed of debate, compromise, and potential for procedural error. I filed Mrs. Fincher's letter in my glove compartment under unsolicited correspondence and resolved to take no action. This, I would learn, was a miscalculation. Mildred P. Fincher was not a woman who waited patiently for an invitation. A week later, the Camden News published a letter to the editor. It was titled, "Are We Subsidizing Our Own Demise?" and was signed Mildred P. Fincher, Acting Secretary, OCCES. In it, she eloquently and forcefully reiterated the points from my flyer, adding her own flair, including a dramatic account of a hummingbird that was bullied away from her feeder by a squadron of what she termed mosquito thugs. The letter concluded with a formal demand for a public town hall meeting with the Ouachita County Mosquito Abatement Board so that their contractor, Mr. Earl T. Shedler, could answer to the people he's endangering. The county, being a body that fears public outcry more than it fears mosquitoes, complied. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday in the wood-paneled community room of the county courthouse annex. I attended, of course, not as a chairman, but as a concerned citizen. I took a seat in the back row wearing a simple seed corn cap that rendered me largely anonymous. The room was nearly full. Mrs. Fincher was in the front row, a veritable general at the head of her troops, armed with a manila folder overflowing with documents that I suspect were mostly printouts of gardening blogs. Earl T. Shedler sat at a long table at the front of the room next to 2 beleaguered-looking members of the Mosquito Abatement Board. He looked deeply uncomfortable in a collared shirt, his face set in a grimace of pain tolerance. The meeting began calmly enough, with a board member explaining the science behind the insecticide. Then the floor was open for questions. Mrs. Fincher shot to her feet. "Mr. Shedler," she began, her voice ringing with clarion call authority, "can you provide this assembly with an ironclad, peer-reviewed guarantee that your chemical concoctions are not, as the committee has warned, creating a generation of insecticide-resistant hypervectors with advanced evasive maneuvering capabilities?" Earl blinked. "A what?" "She means the smart skeeters," a man from the back shouted. The room erupted in a chorus of agreement. One man stood up to ask if the county would be liable for the veterinary bills for his prize basset hound, whose mournful baying was being cruelly mocked by the new, more intelligent pests. Another woman demanded to know if there was a correlation between the spraying and her zinnia's failure to thrive. Earl T. Shedler was woefully unprepared for a scientific debate with a citizenry armed with my carefully crafted fiction. He tried to explain the insecticide's mechanism of action, but was repeatedly interrupted by questions about post-traumatic swarm fortification. He grew red in the face, he lost his temper, he referred to the collected theories as a load of hogwash cooked up by some crackpot. This was a fatal error. He had insulted the intelligence of the very people he was meant to serve. From that moment, he had lost them completely. The meeting ended with the board promising to take all concerns under advisement.
which is bureaucratic language for we hope everyone forgets about this by next week. But the damage was done. I left the meeting and was halfway to my Ranger when I heard footsteps hurrying up behind me. "Bobo, hold on a minute." It was Earl T. Shedler. He looked utterly defeated. The anger was gone, replaced by a look of haggard desperation. He stopped in front of me, breathing heavily. "All right," he said, the word coming out as a sigh of surrender. "You win." "I'm not sure I follow you, Mr. Shedler," I said, feigning innocence. "It seems your customers have some legitimate ecological concerns." He ignored me. "You and me," he said, pointing the finger back and forth between us, "we need to talk. This whole thing, this has gotten out of hand."
That parking lot of the Washita County Air Courthouse Annex is not a place for grand diplomatic summits. It is a simple expanse of asphalt where justice takes a smoke break and civic duty goes to find its car keys. Yet under the jaundiced glare of a sodium vapor lamp that had flickered on in the twilight, a negotiation of profound significance was about to take place. "This has gotten out of hand," Earl T. Shedler repeated, his voice raspy with exhaustion. He had the look of a man who had just wrestled a bear and lost on points. "On the contrary," I replied calmly, "this is a demonstration of the democratic process in its purest form. The citizenry has been made aware of a potential issue and is now engaging in a robust public discourse with its elected officials and their contractors." "Discourse," he scoffed, waving a hand in the direction of the courthouse. "That wasn't discourse. That was a lynch mob with casserole recipes. That Fincher woman has 'em convinced my spray is creating mosquitoes that can do long division. You've got to call her off." "I'm afraid that is not possible. Mildred P. Fincher is not an agent under my command. She is a force of nature that I have merely nudged into motion. The committee has taken on a life of its own." "The committee is you, Bobo," he hissed. "We both know it." "A point of personal privilege," I said, holding up a hand. "Even if I were the sole architect of this public awakening, which I do not formally concede, the issue at hand is not the messenger, but the message. The public's confidence in your methods has been shaken. Your brand is in distress." He ran his hands through his thinning hair, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "So what do you want? Money? You want me to pay for your chicken's therapy?" "General Beauregard's needs are not financial. They are spiritual. The path to de-escalation is and has always been simple. It requires a single corrective action on your part." He stared at me, his eyes narrowing. "Go on." "An apology," I stated. "A formal, direct apology for the initial transgression. The debt of honor must be paid." He looked relieved for a fraction of a second, as if expecting a far more complex demand. "Fine, I'm sorry, okay. I apologize for flying too low and scaring your rooster. There. Are we done?" I shook my head slowly. "The apology is not to be rendered to me. I am merely the rooster's legal counsel in this matter. The aggrieved party is General Beauregard himself." Earl T. Shedler stood perfectly still. The ambient sounds of the evening, the distant traffic on the bypass, the chirr of cicadas, seemed to rush in to fill the silence. "You?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You want me to apologize to a chicken, a bantam rooster of distinguished lineage, and yes, that is the core of my demand." He let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh, a sound devoid of all humor. "You are out of your mind. I am not going to talk to a bird." "Consider the alternative," I said, my tone reasonable and even. Mildred P. Fincher is at this very moment likely drafting a proposal for a countywide mandatory bat house ordinance. The public is questioning your competence. Your contract is up for review in 6 months. A few sincere words spoken to a gallinaceous creature in the privacy of my own property seems a small price to pay for the restoration of public order and the continuation of your livelihood. I had laid my cards on the table. He stood there, weighing his options. On one side of the scale was his pride, his sense of the world as a place where men do not hold conversations with poultry. On the other side was the very real and immediate threat of being driven out of business by a grassroots movement built on a foundation of my own elegant fiction. "What are the terms?" he finally ground out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The terms are simple," I said. "You will present yourself at my property tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp. You will approach General Beauregard's coop. At a distance of no more than 10 feet, you will deliver a clear and unequivocal apology for the distress you caused him. There will be no sarcasm. There will be no condensation. It must be perceived as sincere. And if I do this ridiculous pantomime, the Fincher woman and her smart skeeters just go away. Upon the successful delivery of the apology, I will use what little influence I may have to see that the committee releases a new public statement. This statement will report that, after a productive dialogue with local contractors, they have concluded that the threat of post-traumatic swarm fortification has been somewhat overstated. It will recommend a period of watchful waiting rather than immediate civic action. It should be sufficient to lower the temperature of the public discourse. He stared at a crack in the asphalt for a long time. I could see the battle raging within him. He was a pilot, a man of the sky, being asked to bow to the demands of a creature of the earth. It was a humiliation of the highest order. But the specter of Mildred P. Fincher and her folder full of gardening blogs was, it seemed, even more terrifying. 8 o'clock, he said, biting off the words. He did not look at me. He simply turned and walked to his truck, the slump in his shoulders now a permanent.
Promptly, at 7:55 the next morning, I placed a street-back kitchen chair in the center of my yard, approximately 15 feet from General Beauregard's coop. It was a fine morning, the sky a clean, pale blue, the air holding the last cool remnants of the night. I had prepared a fresh pot of coffee, and I sat sipping it from a simple ceramic mug, the sole spectator in a theater of the absurd of my own making. General Beauregard was already awake, scratching at the dirt and issuing a series of low, interrogative clucks. I had given him a small handful of cracked corn as a preparatory measure, believing a man should not face his antagonist on an empty stomach. He seemed to sense that this was a day of some importance. There was an expectant air about him, a certain straightening of his small but noble posture. At precisely 8 o'clock, the sound of an engine announced the arrival of Earl T. Shedler's Silverado. The truck pulled into my driveway slowly, as if hesitant to commit to its destination. Earl emerged, dressed not in his usual flight suit, but in a pair of jeans and a clean but wrinkled plaid shirt. He carried no props. His hands were empty, jammed into his pockets. He looked like a man on his way to his own execution. He walked across the zoysia grass. I let this particular trespass slide in the spirit of diplomatic immunity, and came to a stop at the designated 10-foot mark from the coop. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the chicken, then at me, then back at the chicken. He was a man wrestling with the last stubborn vestiges of his own dignity. "Go on," I said quietly, giving him an encouraging nod. "He's listening." Earl T. Shedler took a deep breath. he cleared his throat. He fixed his gaze on the wire mesh of the coop where General Beauregard was now watching him with a single, unblinking eye. "All right," he began, his voice a low, mortified mumble. I am here to—" He stopped, squeezed his eyes shut, and started again. "General Beauregard," he said, the name tasting like poison. "I am here today to formally apologize for the incident of the low-altitude flyover. It was inconsiderate. I did not fully appreciate the sensitivity of your nerves. My actions caused you undue stress, and for that, I am sorry." The word sorry came out as a strangled croak, but it was uttered. The debt had been paid. General Beauregard, for his part, did not offer an immediate sign of forgiveness. He simply stared, tilting his head. Then, as if rendering his final judgment on the matter, he shook his entire body with a violent ruffle, stretched his neck toward the morning sky, and let out a crow. It was not his old crow. It was something new. It was louder, sharper, and possessed a note of triumph and scorn I had never heard before. It was the sound of a rooster who not only faced his demon, but had forced that demon to formally acknowledge its wrongdoing in a public forum. It was the sound of vindication. Earl T. Shedler looked at me, his face a mask of profound humiliation. "There. Are we done?" I took a slow sip of my coffee. "We are done." He turned without another word and walked back to his truck. I did not watch him leave. Later that day, I drove to the Camden Library. Using the public computer, I composed the final public statement from the Ouachita County Citizens Committee for Ecological Sanity. It reported that recent atmospheric and entomological data suggested the threat of post-traumatic swarm fortification was stabilizing. It praised the newfound spirit of cooperation from local contractors and recommended that the public table the Bat House initiative for the time being. I printed a single copy and mailed it to Mildred P. Fincher, marking it for immediate release. I then drove to the post office and closed the box that had served as the committee's headquarters. My work was finished. The mosquito panic in Ouachita County subsided as quickly as it had begun. Earl T. Shedler continued his work, though his flight path over my property now described a wide and respectful arc. Life returned to its normal, quiet rhythm. That evening, I sat on my porch as the sun went down, a glass of sweet tea in my hand. From his coop, I heard the sounds of a contented rooster settling in for the night. The apology had not been for me, but I felt its effects nonetheless. The scales of justice had been balanced. The moral universe of my small patch of South Arkansas was once again in order. Honor had been satisfied.